For 3 years, Nancy Warner fed a blind old man at a roadside diner, paying for his meals out of her own meager tips. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, the routine was shattered when 10 armored black sedans screeched to a halt, blocking the restaurant's entrance. The men inside weren't there to eat. They weren't there to arrest her. They were there because the man Nancy had been treating like a grandfather was a legendary general who had vanished from the public eye years ago. Waitress fed a blind old man for 3 years. One day, 10 black sedans blocked the restaurant door. Nancy R. Warner was used to being invisible. She was a waitress in a town that most people only drove through on their way to somewhere better. Between the long shifts, the demanding manager, and the stack of bills waiting at home, Nancy's life was a cycle of exhaustion. But every day at 2 p.m., the bells above the diner door would chime, and Nancy would drop everything to help Richard Yee Graham. To the other customers, Richard was just a frail, blind man with an eye patch and tattered clothes. To Nancy's manager, he was a waste of a booth. She didn't know that Richard had once led armies across continents. She didn't know that his ramblings about history were actually classified memories. She didn't even know that a team of federal agents had been tracking his location for months. Nancy didn't help him because she expected a reward. She helped him because she knew what it felt like to be forgotten, and she refused to let him face the dark alone. The Morning Star Diner was the kind of place where the coffee was always burnt and the linoleum floors had lost their shine decades ago. For Nancy, the diner wasn't just a job, it was a battlefield of survival. Her feet ached before noon, and her spirit felt as thin as the paper napkins she tucked into the dispensers. The town of Oak Ridge was a place that moved in slow motion, inhabited by people who felt the world had moved on without them. It was a rainy Tuesday 3 years ago that the world changed, though Nancy didn't know it yet. The lunch rush had just cleared out, leaving the air heavy with the scent of grease and dish soap. Her manager, a man named Miller, who valued a nickel more than a human life, was already hovering by the register, grumbling about the low margins. Then the bells above the door chimed, a weak, hesitant sound. A man shuffled in, his movements stiff and uncertain. He wore a heavy, dated trench coat that had seen better days, and a hat pulled low. But it was his face that caught Nancy's attention. A thick black patch covered his left eye, and his right eye moved restlessly, never quite landing on anything. He carried a wooden cane, tapping it lightly against the table legs as he navigated the narrow aisle.
"Table 7, Nancy whispered to herself, dropping her tray and moving toward him. It was the quietest booth in the back, tucked away from the draft of the door. As he reached the table, his foot caught on the edge of the carpet. He stumbled, his thin frame swaying like a tree in a storm. Before Miller could bark a warning about drunkards, Nancy was there. She caught the man's elbow, her grip firm but gentle. "I've got you, sir," she said, her voice a soft contrast to the clatter of the kitchen. "Easy does it. Let's get you settled right here." The man froze at her touch. For a second, his posture shifted, his shoulders squared, and his chin lifted with a sudden, ghost-like authority that seemed out of place in a dusty diner. Then, just as quickly, the moment passed, and he sank into the vinyl booth with a weary sigh. "Thank you, miss," he rasped. His voice was like dry parchment, but there was a refined cadence to it. Nancy pulled a menu from the holder, but then she saw his hand hovering over the table, searching for the edge. She realized then that the eye patch wasn't just for show. The man was completely blind. "My name's Nancy," she said, placing a glass of water exactly where his hand could find it. "I'm going to be your waitress. Today we have the beef stew and fresh biscuits. It's the best thing on the menu, especially on a cold day like this." The man tilted his head, listening to her with an intensity that made Nancy feel, for the first time in years, like she was being truly heard. "Nancy," he repeated, testing the name. "A classic name. I'm Richard, and I'm afraid I've left my wallet in my other coat, Nancy. Perhaps I should just sit for a moment and then move on." Nancy looked back at Miller, who was watching them like a hawk. She knew Richard was lying. She could see the shame in the way he wouldn't meet her gaze. Without a word, she reached into her own apron pocket and felt the $5 bill she'd earned in tips that morning. "Don't worry about that, Richard," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The first one is on the house. Table 7 is lucky today." She didn't know then that she wasn't just feeding a hungry man. She was beginning a journey that would lead her from the grease of the diner to the highest halls of power. She simply saw a man who needed a hand, and she chose to hold it. As the weeks stretched into months, Richard became a permanent fixture at Table 7. Every afternoon at 2 p.m., the soft tap-tap-tap of his cane would signal his arrival, and Nancy would have a hot plate of food waiting before he even sat down. But in the small, cramped world of the Morning Star Diner, kindness was a luxury that Miller, the manager, refused to afford.
Miller was a man whose soul seemed to have been replaced by a ledger. He spent his days perched behind the register, his eyes darting around the room, looking for any sign of waste. To him, Richard was an eyesore, a non-paying customer who took up space that could be used by real patrons. He didn't see the man who told stories of the starlit nights in the Mediterranean or the quiet dignity with which Richard held his fork. He only saw the bottom line. "He's back again, Warner," Miller's voice hissed behind Nancy one afternoon, sharp enough to cut through the steam of the dishwasher. "I checked the receipts from yesterday. You rang up 3 coffees and a slice of pie, but I saw you carry out a full roast beef dinner to that booth. Care to explain the math?" Nancy felt a cold knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. She kept her back to him, wiping down the counter with a cloth that was already damp. "The customer had a coupon, Mr. Miller, an old one from the morning mailer." "Don't lie to me," Miller growled, stepping closer until she could smell the stale tobacco on his breath. "There are no coupons for roast beef. You're feeding that old drifter on my dime. This isn't a soup kitchen. If I see one more missing plate go to Table 7, you're out on the street with him. Do I make myself clear?" Nancy nodded silently, her knuckles white as she gripped the counter. She waited until Miller retreated to his office before she let out a shaky breath. She couldn't stop. She had seen the way Richard's hands trembled less after a warm meal. She had seen the way his face lit up when she sat with him for 5 minutes to describe the sunset outside the window. To stop now would be to admit that the world was as cold and calculating as Miller believed it to be. So the secret tab began. Nancy started working double shifts, picking up the dirty jobs no one else wanted just to earn an extra few dollars in tips. Every cent she made went into a small, chipped jar she hid in the back of her locker. When it came time to ring up Richard's meal, she would surreptitiously slip her own money into the register, ringing in a staff meal or a discontinued item to keep the inventory levels from raising a red flag. She became a master of the silent handoff. She would slide a plate in front of Richard while Miller was distracted by a delivery, whispering the description of the food directly into the old man's ear. "Today is chicken pot pie, Richard," she'd murmur, her voice a soft anchor for him. "The crust is golden brown, just the way you like it." One afternoon, Richard reached out and caught her wrist as she turned to leave. His touch was light, but his sightless eye seemed to look right through her. "You're carrying a heavy burden for me, Nancy," he said softly. "I can hear the way your shoes scuff the floor. You're tired. You shouldn't be doing this." "I'm doing just fine, Richard," Nancy lied, forcing a smile into her voice that she hoped he could feel. "Table 7 is still the luckiest spot in the house." She didn't tell him about the threats from Miller or the fact that she was skipping her own dinner to make ends meet. She didn't know that Richard was keeping a mental ledger of his own, one that recorded every sacrifice she made in the name of a stranger. The seasons outside the diner's fogged windows shifted from the golden hues of autumn to a biting iron-gray winter, but the atmosphere at Table 7 remained a world apart.
Richard seemed to grow more talkative as the temperature dropped, his voice becoming a steady, rhythmic hum that cut through the clatter of silverware and the hum of the neon signs. As Nancy adjusted her secret tab to include extra hot tea for his shivering hands, Richard began to pay her back in a currency she didn't quite understand: stories. They weren't the typical stories of a man his age, nostalgic ramblings about childhood or old flames. Instead, Richard spoke of the world as if it were a giant chessboard he had once helped move. "The air in the Ardennes has a specific weight to it, Nancy," he remarked one afternoon, his sightless eye fixed on a point somewhere beyond the diner walls. "It smells of damp pine and cold iron. We sat in a bunker for 3 days, waiting for a signal that never came from the embassy in Brussels. We had to make a choice: follow the orders that were 12 hours old, or trust the silence." Nancy smiled as she topped off his mug, tucked a stray hair behind her ear, and nodded. "That sounds like quite the movie, Richard. My father used to love those old war films." Richard let out a soft, dry chuckle. "It wasn't a movie, dear girl. It was a Tuesday, just like today." On another occasion, while the local news on the overhead TV reported on a diplomatic standoff in the Middle East, Richard leaned in close, his voice dropping to a sandpaper whisper. "They're looking at the wrong mountain range, you know. If they want to find the negotiation site, they need to look at the coordinates near the old salt mines. That's where the underground cables were laid back in '94. I watched the blueprints being signed myself." Nancy patted his hand, her heart aching with a mixture of affection and pity. She assumed these were the colorful hallucinations of a mind trying to escape the confines of a lonely, dark room. She imagined him as a young man who perhaps had read too many Tom Clancy novels or worked a low-level desk job in a government building, inflating his memories to fill the silence of his current life. "You certainly have a vivid imagination, Richard. You should have been a writer." "I was a ghost, Nancy," he replied, his expression turning uncharacteristically solemn. "A ghost who moved through rooms where the fate of millions was decided with a stroke of a pen. But the most important thing I ever learned wasn't found in a briefing room. It was found right here, in the way you bring me this tea without me asking." Despite her skepticism, Nancy found herself enthralled. He spoke of the taste of salt air in Singapore, the specific shade of blue on the Moroccan coast, and the cold, clinical feel of a situation room deep beneath the earth. He described people, presidents, prime ministers, and generals, not as icons, but as men with sweaty palms and nervous tics. To Nancy, these were beautiful fantasies, a way for an old man to feel powerful again. She didn't notice the way Richard's hand occasionally moved with a strange, practiced precision, or how he seemed to know exactly when a mysterious car slowed down in the parking lot. She simply listened, providing the audience he so clearly craved, unaware that every fantasy he shared was a piece of a classified puzzle that the rest of the world was still trying to solve. The shift started subtly, a cold draft that had nothing to do with the winter air leaking through the diner's front door. For a few days, Nancy felt a prickle on the back of her neck, the unmistakable sensation of being scrutinized. It wasn't Miller's greedy gaze or the hungry stares of the truckers. It was something clinical, detached, and far more dangerous. It happened on a Thursday, during the quiet lull between the lunch rush and the early bird specials. Richard had just finished his meal and was describing the intricate architecture of a safe house in Berlin when a man Nancy had never seen before walked in. He didn't look like he belonged in Oak Ridge. His suit was charcoal gray, tailored with a precision that made the diner's vinyl booths look even shabbier, and his shoes didn't have a speck of salt or slush on them. He didn't sit at the counter. He didn't order coffee. Instead, he leaned against a pillar near the kitchen pass-through, watching Table 7 with an intensity that made Nancy's heart skip a beat. When Richard finally tapped his cane and made his slow, rhythmic exit, the stranger didn't follow him. He waited until the bells above the door settled. Then he slid into a stool at the counter, directly in front of Nancy. "He's a creature of habit, isn't he?" the man asked. His voice was smooth, devoid of any local accent, sounding like the very ghosts Richard often described. Nancy wiped the counter, trying to keep her hands from shaking. "He's a loyal customer. We appreciate loyalty here." The man didn't smile. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a photograph. It was grainy, taken from a distance, showing Nancy walking Richard to the edge of the parking lot a week prior. "You've been paying for his meals for 312 days, Nancy. You take double shifts to cover his tab. You've even lied to your employer to protect him."
The air in the diner felt suddenly thin. Nancy looked toward Miller's office, but the door was shut. "Who are you? Is Richard in some kind of trouble?" "Trouble is a relative term," the man replied, leaning in. His eyes were like flint. "I'm more interested in your motivation. Why do you do it?" He's a blind, penniless old man who tells tall tales. He has nothing to give you. No family, no money, no future. Why waste your life on a ghost? Nancy felt a surge of defensive heat rise in her chest, drowning out her fear. She set the cleaning rag down and looked the stranger in the eye. "Because he's a human being," she said, her voice low and steady. "And in case you haven't noticed, the world is pretty short on people who treat him like one. He might not have anything to give, but he deserves to be seen. If that's a waste of my life, then I'm fine with that." The man studied her for a long, agonizing moment. For a second, the hardness in his gaze flickered, replaced by something that looked almost like respect. He stood up, adjusted his tie, and placed a crisp $100 bill on the counter, not for a meal, but as if it were a marker. "He told me you were different," the man whispered, almost to himself. Then he looked at her with a chilling gravity. "Be careful," Nancy warned her. "Sometimes when you shine a light on someone hiding in the dark, you end up standing in the spotlight yourself. Stop asking questions about his past, for your own sake." Without another word, he turned and vanished into the gray afternoon. Nancy watched him go, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked back at Table 7, now empty and silent, and realized for the first time that the fantasies Richard shared weren't just stories. They were the reason men in suits were coming for him. The following Tuesday began like any other, but the air inside the Morning Star diner felt heavy, as if the oxygen had been replaced by a thick, suffocating static. Nancy found herself glancing at the clock every few minutes, her eyes tracing the familiar path from the grease-stained kitchen clock to the worn-out vinyl of Table 7. 2 p.m. arrived. The bells above the door remained silent. At 2:05, Nancy stood by the coffee urns, her hands trembling as she adjusted the sugar packets. At 2:15, she walked to the front window, pressing her forehead against the cool glass, searching the sidewalk for the slow, rhythmic tap of a wooden cane. The street was empty, save for a few swirling dead leaves and a stray dog. In 3 years, 1,095 days, Richard had never missed a visit. Through flu season, through the great blizzard that had buried the town in 2 feet of white powder, and even through the days when his breathing sounded like gravel in a tin can, he had always appeared. He was a man of military precision, a clock that never lost a second. His absence wasn't just a break in routine, it was a scream in a silent room. "He's not coming, Warner,"
Miller's voice barked from the register, sounding uncomfortably triumphant. Finally realized the gravy train ran out of steam. Or maybe he finally kicked the bucket in whatever alley he calls home. Move that salt shaker and get to work on the lunch prep. Nancy didn't snap back. She couldn't. A cold, hollow dread had settled in her chest. She remembered the man in the charcoal suit and the warning he had left behind like a poison pill. Sometimes when you shine a light on someone hiding in the dark, you end up standing in the spotlight yourself. She spent the afternoon moving like a ghost. She brought a grilled cheese to table 4 and forgot the napkins. She dropped a glass in the kitchen, the shattering sound making her jump so violently she nearly fell. Every time the door opened, her heart leapt into her throat, only to sink back down when a stranger walked through the door, instead of a frail man with an eye patch. By 5 p.m., the dread had turned into a desperate, gnawing certainty. Something was wrong. Richard hadn't just stayed home. He had been taken, or he had fallen, or the ghosts he talked about had finally caught up to his shadow. She realized then, with a sharp pang of grief, that she didn't even know where he lived. She had spent 3 years feeding his soul, yet she didn't have a phone number, an address, or a single way to reach him. She walked over to table 7 and sat down in the seat he usually occupied. She ran her fingers over the deep scratch in the laminate table where he used to rest his cane. The diner felt cavernous and cruel without him. She looked out at the parking lot, and for a fleeting second she saw a dark car idling near the edge of the property, its headlights off. It lingered for a moment before gliding away into the shadows of the evening. Nancy didn't go home after her shift. She sat in her car in the darkened lot, her breath fogging the windshield, staring at the empty booth through the diner window. The silence was an answer she didn't want to hear. The man she had protected was gone, and the world he had warned her about was finally closing in. The following morning, the Morning Star Diner was draped in a thick, unnatural fog that seemed to swallow the street whole. Nancy moved through her chores with leaden limbs, her eyes red from a sleepless night spent wondering if Richard was lying cold in some forgotten room. The diner was nearly empty, save for a few regulars nursing their coffee, and Miller, who was hunched over his accounts, his calculator clicking like a predatory insect. The clock struck 10 a.m., and the world outside the front window suddenly darkened. It wasn't a cloud. It was a fleet. One by one, sleek, armored black sedans began to pull into the gravel lot, moving with a synchronized, predatory grace. They didn't park, they maneuvered, forming a tactical semicircle that effectively walled off the diner from the rest of the world. The sunlight glinted off the tinted glass, creating a wall of impenetrable blackness.
Inside, the chatter died instantly. A truck driver at the counter froze with a fork halfway to his mouth. Miller stood up, his face drained of color, his hands gripping the edge of the register. "What the hell is this?" he stammered. "Nancy, what did you do?" Nancy didn't answer. She stood frozen by the coffee station, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She counted them. 1, 4, 7, 10. 10 identical vehicles, engines humming in a low, vibrating chord that shook the salt shakers on the tables. Suddenly, the doors of the lead vehicle opened. Men in dark suits and tactical gear stepped out, their movements crisp and terrifyingly efficient. 2 men took positions at the entrance, their arms crossed, their earpieces glinting. They weren't police, and they weren't local. They carried the unmistakable aura of the federal government, the ghosts Richard had warned her about. "Lock the doors," Miller screamed, panic finally breaking through his voice. "Nobody comes in. Nancy, call the sheriff." But before Nancy could move, the front door swung open with a force that sent the bells chiming in a frantic, panicked jangle. The 2 men in suits stepped inside, scanning the room with cold, calculating eyes. Behind them, a man in a crisp military uniform, thick with medals and stars that caught the dim diner light, stepped over the threshold. He walked with a confidence that commanded the air out of the room. The customers scrambled back, sliding deep into their booths as if trying to disappear into the vinyl. Miller dropped to his knees behind the counter, hiding his head. Only Nancy remained standing. She felt a strange, icy calm settle over her. She knew this was about Richard. She knew the spotlight the man in the charcoal suit had warned her about was finally shining directly on her. The officer in the lead vehicle didn't look at the trembling manager or the frightened patrons. He looked directly at Nancy, his gaze lingering on her worn apron and the tired lines around her eyes. "Nancy R. Warner?" he asked. His voice wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact that carried the weight of a mountain. Nancy swallowed hard, her hand instinctively reaching for the damp rag she had used to clean table 7 1,000 times. "I am," she whispered, her voice cracking but holding steady. "I am General Vance," he said, stepping forward until the smell of starch and cold rain filled her senses. "We've been looking for someone, and we were told that you are the only one who knows where he spent his final hours." The silence in the diner was so heavy it felt as though the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. General Vance stood in the center of the linoleum floor, a towering figure of polished brass and ironed wool that made the Morning Star diner look like a dollhouse made of cardboard. He didn't look at the grease-stained menus or the flickering neon sign. His eyes swept the room with tactical precision, dismissing the trembling regulars and the whimpering manager until they landed on Nancy.
"I am looking for the one they call the caregiver," the general announced. His voice was deep, echoing off the low ceilings with an authority that didn't need to be raised to be terrifying. "The woman who sat at table 7. Miller, sensing a chance to deflect any potential trouble, pointed a shaking finger from behind the counter. "It's her, Nancy. Whatever that old man did, I had nothing to do with it. I told her he was a vagrant. I told her to kick him out." General Vance turned his head slowly, his gaze pinning Miller to the spot like a specimen under glass. The look was so cold that Miller's mouth snapped shut instantly. The general then turned back to Nancy, his expression softening by a fraction, a microscopic shift that only someone as observant as a waitress would notice. "Miss Warner," he said, stepping closer. The soldiers at the door remained as still as statues, their presence a wall of black glass between the diner and the outside world. "I am the Chief of Staff for the United States Army. I have traveled across the country because of a series of encrypted reports that reached my desk last night. Reports that didn't come from satellites or deep cover agents, but from a man who hadn't spoken to the Pentagon in over a decade." Nancy's heart felt as though it were vibrating in time with the idling sedans outside. "Is Richard? Is he okay?" The general removed his cap, holding it against his chest. It was a gesture of profound, somber respect that sent a shockwave through the room. "General Richard Ye Graham passed away peacefully in his sleep 2 nights ago, Miss Warner. He was a hero of the highest order, a man who saved this nation more times than the history books will ever be allowed to print. He was also a man who chose to disappear when he felt the world had become a place he no longer recognized." A collective gasp rippled through the booths. The blind old man with the eye patch and the tattered coat was a general? The stories Nancy had dismissed as fantasies, the bunkers in the Ardennes, the salt mines, the secret negotiations, flashed through her mind with the blinding light of truth. They weren't the ramblings of a broken mind. They were the memoirs of a lion in exile. "He spent his final years testing a theory," Vance continued, his voice dropping to a more intimate register. "He wanted to know if a person with nothing left to give, no rank,
no sight, no power, could still find a reason to believe in humanity. He lived in the shadows of this town to see if anyone would see the man behind the eye patch. The general reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet-lined box. He opened it to reveal a silver star, its surface gleaming even in the dim diner light. He told us in his final communiqué that he found his answer at table 7. He called you his final commanding officer, Nancy, because when the rest of the world looked away, you stood your post.
General Vance signaled to one of the officers, who stepped forward and placed a sleek, military-grade tablet on the scarred laminate of the counter. The screen flickered to life, and suddenly the diner was gone. In its place was a sun-drenched room filled with books and maps. Sitting in a high-backed leather chair was Richard. He wasn't wearing the tattered trench coat or the eye patch. He wore a simple, crisp white shirt, and though his eyes were still sightless, he looked vital, his posture echoing the hidden authority Nancy had glimpsed 3 years prior. The customers leaned out of their booths, and even Miller crept closer, silenced by the sheer gravity of the image. "Nancy," the voice on the recording said. It was the same dry parchment rasp, but it carried a resonance that filled every corner of the Morning Star diner. "If you are seeing this, it means I've finally moved on to a place where the light is better. I'm sorry I missed our Tuesday. I suppose even a general has to follow the ultimate set of orders eventually." A small, sad smile played on the recorded lips. "For 3 years you fed a ghost. You paid for my meals with money you didn't have, and you defended me against a world that prefers its heroes to be loud and shiny. You saw me when I was invisible. You narrated the world for me when mine was nothing but shadows. You thought you were just being kind, but Nancy, you were keeping a weary soldier alive." The man in the video leaned forward, his expression turning solemn. "My life was spent in rooms where we weighed the lives of thousands against the needs of nations. It was a cold, hard existence. But in that small booth at table 7, you reminded me that the nation is just a collection of people like you, who are willing to sacrifice for a stranger. You gave me back my faith in the very thing I spent 40 years fighting to protect." Richard paused, and for a moment the only sound in the diner was the low hum of the refrigerator. "I have no heirs, Nancy, no family to carry on the Graham name, but I have a legacy. In my will, I have named you the sole executor of the Richard Young Graham Foundation. The estate, the properties, and the funds I spent a lifetime accumulating are now yours to command. Your days of counting tips and dodging managers are over. I've left instructions for the general to assist you. Your new mission is to find the others, the invisible, the forgotten, the ones the world crosses the street to avoid, and show them the light you showed me." The recording faded to black, leaving a profound, ringing silence in its wake. Nancy felt the tears finally break, hot and fast, blurring her vision. She looked at the empty seat at table 7. She had seen a man who needed a hand. She hadn't realized she was holding the hand of a giant. General Vance closed the tablet and looked at Nancy with a crisp, respectful nod. "The cars are waiting, Miss Warner. Your life is no longer behind this counter. It's time to go." The transition happened with a quietness that felt louder than the sirens and the engines outside. Nancy looked down at her hands, reddened by dishwater and calloused by years of carrying heavy trays. For a moment, her gaze drifted to the grease-stained apron tied around her waist,
the fabric that had been her armor in a long, losing battle against poverty. With fingers that finally stopped trembling, she reached behind her back and untied the knot. She pulled the apron over her head and laid it carefully across the counter of the Morning Star Diner. It looked small and insignificant beneath the fluorescent lights, a relic of a life she was leaving behind. "Nancy, wait!" Miller's voice broke the silence, but the edge was gone, replaced by a desperate, fawning whine. "I didn't know. I mean, we can work something out. You can be the head waitress. I'll give you a raise." Nancy didn't turn back. She didn't feel anger or even triumph. She felt a profound sense of peace. Miller was part of a world that measured worth in nickels and power in intimidation. Richard had taught her a different scale. General Vance stepped aside, extending an arm toward the door. As Nancy walked past the booths, the regulars stood up. The truck driver she'd served for years tipped his cap, his eyes wide with a new kind of reverence. She stopped briefly at table 7, resting her hand one last time on the cool laminate. She could almost smell the faint scent of Richard's tea and the dry, wise woodiness of his presence. "Goodbye, Richard," she whispered. "I'll make sure they're seen." As she stepped out of the diner, the morning fog had begun to lift, pierced by shafts of golden sunlight that turned the gravel lot into a field of diamonds. The soldiers stood at attention, a living corridor of steel and honor. One of them held the door of the lead sedan open, a world of black leather and quiet luxury waiting to receive her. Nancy paused at the threshold of the car, looking back at the crumbling sign of the Morning Star Diner. She thought of the secret tab, the hidden jars of change, and the tired shifts she had worked just to keep an old man's plate full. She realized now that she hadn't been the one serving him. He had been the one preparing her for this moment, showing her that the greatest leadership begins with the simplest act of service. She stepped into the vehicle, and the heavy door closed with a soft, expensive thud that shut out the noise of her old life forever. As the motorcade began to move, gliding away from the roadside diner and toward the sprawling estate that now bore her name, Nancy R. Warner looked out the tinted glass. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was the guardian of a hero's legacy. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't just surviving the day. She was heading toward the dawn.
If this story hit home, drop your thoughts in the comments. Like the video and subscribe to Syndicate Boss Files for raw, unfiltered stories that tell the truth. No sugarcoating, no shortcuts. More stories are coming.